How Books Work, Real Talk with editors, agents, and publishing insiders. Hosted by writers Julie Satow and Alice Robb. In this conversation, Libby Burton discusses her role as an editor, the intersection of art and commerce, changing the dynamics of publishing, and creating a more inclusive industry. Libby Burton is an executive editor at Crown. She publishes both practical and narrative nonfiction with an eye for stories and insight from traditionally underrepresented voices. She has edited a wide range of award-winning and best-selling authors, including Stacey Abrams, Katie Porter, Mariah Carey, Melissa Broder, Jessica Valenti, and Liz Lenz. She is also the author of the poetry collection Soft Volcano. Hi, Libby. Welcome to the show.
Oh, how's your poetry going, by the way? Are you still writing?
I am still writing. I actually saw some poetry friends last night, which was delightful. We met for a holiday poets dinner and we traded poems. So yeah, it's still happening and still keeps me sane and grounded and paying attention to what really matters. Yeah. So it's a great practice.
Sure. It was so interesting. I did this like residency and there was a bunch of poets and it was so interesting to like see them work and be so specific about each word they're using. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like we're just kind of like, I feel like it's like diarrhea of the mouth or whatever, like when you're doing more, versus anyway.
Versus like the poets are like, I know people are like, oh, you wrote a whole book. I'm like, I wrote a whole book of poetry. Like it's not a lot of words, but it is true that each word is definitely given a lot of consideration. So
much consideration. It is so fascinating.
Do you feel like your poetry, or your work as a poet informs your editing?
Yeah.
Or the other way
completely.
Around?
The poetry definitely informs the editing. And I will say the editing informs the poetry as well, too. The poetry informs the editing because I was literally taught to examine each word and like sort of ask the question, like, does it do the job that it needs to on like multiple levels? I studied poetry as an undergraduate. I studied it as a graduate student as well, too. And that just really helps you respect words and like how they're used. I love line editing. I love sort of bringing language to the level that it wants to be. And I mean that sort of like, I actually learned that from workshopping with other writers, which is to say that like, not every poem, not every book, not every chapter needs to be a very specific way. It needs to be the best possible iteration of itself. And finding the best words in the best order to do that it's a joy. I wish I had more time to do it because it is my favorite part of the whole entire job. But I do like other jobs, other aspects of being an editor as well too. But that's definitely when I'm doing that, when I'm editing word by word, I'm like, that's my happy place.
That's so cool. Obviously like there's such a kind of I don't know if it's really true, but like a reputation that editors don't edit anymore. You know what I mean?
I know. There's that cliche, which is true. In my experience and my colleagues, I can't speak of all my colleagues, but I would say many of them, it's completely not true. It is not only are we often, especially in nonfiction, building books with writers for the first time, which is to say many people, Julie, maybe you know this experience of like, you've written a lot of articles, you've written sort of a lot of like things, maybe up to like 10,000 or even 20,000 words, but that sort of leap to the next level of 75,000 to 100,000 words is a process. And so a lot of first time writers, I know editors work really closely with them to do that. And I work really closely with my writers to do that. And I will say in the actual sort of line by line, my most sort of illustrious colleagues and smartest colleagues, they're in the trenches with writers. And yeah, so that cliche is not true. Or maybe there was some lazy editors in the 80s and 90s that gave publishing that bad reputation.
How much of your day is taken up with meetings and reading proposals and whatever else editors do?
I know. Editors at their core, they are project managers who are real good at reading. That's what I think of it as. But also I never thought the job of editing was, when I was a grad student, when I was an undergrad, like what it actually is so much different than what I anticipated, which is I believe it's and if you're effective at it, it's a very social job, honestly. And it's also like, you have to understand markets in a lot of ways. And But then it all also boils down to understanding the experience of reading and what actually can motivate someone to pay $30 for a new book. But all that comes into play with reading, understanding markets, and also then the relationships. And the relationships are with agents, they're with writers, they're with teams within a corporate structure. So that is a roundabout way of saying not always a huge percentage of my day is spent editing, but a chunk, I try to do a chunk every day. I am a morning person, so I wake up early, and I did this morning. I woke up at 6 a.m. and I edited one chapter from a writer who is writing her first book. She's an expert in her field, but she's never written anything longer than like an academic article. So I'm helping her with that process. 8 to 10 hours spent on actual work, and maybe like 10 to 20% of that editing, and the rest is meetings and research and a million other things. So that's the kind of nature of corporate publishing these days.
I just want to say I can attest to the fact that you are an amazing editor, because I had never written a book before, and you did, like, I gave you chapter by chapter, which, I mean, now that I think about that, I'm like, wow, I can't believe you like let me do that. But also, like, you really did. That was huge. So that's great. I wonder, like, if you could talk about, I think from a writer's perspective, part of what motivated us to want to do this podcast was that it feels so much like a black box, what you're actually doing at Penguin Random House or in those meetings, how it works, what the dynamics are, what, I don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Totally. And I'm glad that you guys are doing this, because for a long time, publishing has been this sort of very opaque black box, like culturally, and also from like a power perspective. Because I think this is true. Book publishers are like cultural gatekeepers. And for a long time, that was shaped by sexism and racism and classism. And a big goal of mine while working within a corporate structure is to sort of change that dynamic in a lot of ways, with both the content of my books and then also the work that I do within this corporate behemoth that allows me to have my job. So yeah, where to start with sort of like what goes on in the inside? I'd say, I don't know. Like I like specific.
Okay. Yeah. So what do you think would be helpful for writers to know about what goes on in the inside? Like, are there certain, like, marketing and publicity, for instance, between, the editor and then the marketing teams and the sales team and publicity, like that is very unclear to many of us.
Yes, totally. Okay. So I will say, starting from, say you want to publish a book and you're maybe in any sort of place in a writing career, from a nonfiction perspective, and sort of that's what I can speak to. That's where I've like honed my expertise for the last decade. Market is a critical element to this, which is to say, I do believe that we exist at the intersection of art and commerce, which is like, I believe that I'm helping put art into the world, but I'm also putting art into the world that needs to sell and needs to sort of appeal to a wide audience. So the question is, how can I sort of like hedge my bets as much as possible to say that like this book will appeal to a massive amount of people? And honestly, while we have sort of opened up the idea of like who can write a book and who should write a book, there's still a question of like, who then will get that book to as many readers as possible. So we are looking at writers with a platform a lot of times, which is not to say that you can't just go away in like a cabin and write a like phenomenal book and then, sell it to a publisher and have it sell hundreds of thousands of copies. That can still happen, but it's getting harder and harder. And we are often looking for authors who can bring their own audience and have built a platform in the form of social media or publishing journalism, or have certain connections in those worlds that will help us then get that book to a lot of readers. It's empowering in a lot of ways, because if you are an author with something to say and a powerful platform, like, we will help you and we will, help you hone that message in the best way possible. And I've done that with lots of writers, but also to say that like the bar is very high for both the content of the books and then also the audience that an author may bring to the table. So those are the questions that we are talking about within sort of publicity and marketing meetings as well. Sort of how do we leverage an audience that an author has? And how do we find additional audiences for a specific book? That is what we're thinking about all the time.
So do you think that that it maybe used to be more editor driven and now it's more sales and marketing driven, like that they have more say in the process?
They have a lot
now.
of say.
Okay.
And I think they have to have a say because we don't have a lot of choices. Like the book buying like market is, grew over the pandemic. It's shrunk a little bit. And we are just finding, in order to find an audience for a book, we need to sort of pull all those marketing and publicity levers as much as possible. At the end of the day, though, the content of the book, generally, there are obviously exceptions, still needs to be phenomenal and also like serve people and readers where they are. And an example of this that is really sort of heartening for me is that my imprint Crown published a book called Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond this year, which was a tremendous, like huge bestseller, really well reviewed, and, sold hundreds of thousands of copies already. It is not an easy book to read. And a lot of those book buyers, I believe, may feel implicated by that book. And that's the point, which is to say that like poverty exists in America because of our actions. But that book was named the #1 Goodreads nonfiction book for the whole entire year. And Goodreads is a very democratic sort of way of rating books because anyone can put any book on there and like score it anyway. There's no gatekeeping like at the New York Times. So that's really like affirming to me that like this book that it's not an easy read, but is a very rigorous and important read is still reaching a lot of people and getting them to think and changing their minds. So things like that keep me going.
Yeah. I mean, one person that we interviewed was an agent who was talking about how the nonfiction market has been, the sales have been down this year. Definitely. Is that what you're inferring?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's something that we have seen. Yeah. People are often trying to escape into fiction, which I think is tremendous. I am among those people who like loves reading fiction for escapist reasons. And nonfiction, like it's harder if it's not sort of giving people very practical, pragmatic ways to improve their lives, or sort of meeting them in a very specific place or celebrity driven. It is hard to get people to buy those books, but that's our challenge.
You mentioned Goodreads and how democratic it is. I'm curious how much weight publishers give to things like Goodreads reviews. And I mean, I don't know. I was just reading about the like review bombing campaign.
The review bombing. I know, exactly. Stuff like that. I would say any one review, like not a lot, but in aggregate, a lot of it. But that's the interesting thing too about review bombing, which is to say that like it's social media. So it can be sort of like controlled and also, exploited in ways by bad actors in certain ways, right? Like it wasn't intended to be used that way. It's supposed to say like you read a book and you tell other people how you feel about it, like 1-to-1, easy peasy. But, it's imperfect as anything is. So we do, it's like a tool. It's like one other tool that we have to use. And I think it's not a bad thing that it is more democratic than some. But again, like any social media tool, it can be sort of exploited and used in different ways.
That's really interesting. I wonder what I guess, okay. So if it's challenging and if publicity and marketing and platform and all those things we all hear about are so important, when you're an acquiring editor, obviously, are there certain things you're looking for topic wise or that, hit those marks that you feel like are, obviously there's certain trends that happen. I don't know. Is there a trend you're trying to get? Like what's appealing to you right now, I guess?
Totally. I would say what's appealing to me and the markets in a lot of places are practical, pragmatic, sort of prescriptive is like kind of going far in that direction, but sort of books that give people tangible tools for living in a better way in a changing world. And that can take many forms. Like I have been, as mentioned, I have a 2-year-old. So I've been reading in the parenting space a lot. And I've also been acquiring and editing books in the parenting space because I understand that market at this moment. I understand the sort of challenges it takes to be a parent in 2023, even with all the privilege that I bring to the experience. As I tell my friends and future expecting parents, I didn't think America hated me until I had a kid. And like, which is like hilarious, but also sad. Like it's tough. Like childcare is really expensive. Like balancing having a full-time demanding, intellectually and emotionally engaging job plus raising a child is really, really hard. So giving people tools to do that in the best way and the most thoughtful way, I'm really invested in that too, as well. Like, as Julie knows, because we work together, I'm always interested in untold histories and histories that sort of like change how we view something that we thought that we knew, be that sort of like the intersection of history, architecture, and power in New York City in the form of Plaza Hotel, or say I have a book coming from like about the history of ballroom and drag and sort of how the origins of that whole practice in, the mid 20th century evolved into RuPaul's Drag Race. And I'm always interested in histories that are not written by white, cishet, privileged men, because they wrote our histories for a very long time. And those things will always appeal to me. Also, tools that give sort of anyone who's been an outsider, be that a woman, person of color, non-binary, or sort of like non-straight individual, tools to, have access and make their lives better. I'm always interested in that. The flip side though, and as your question sort of alluded to, I also need to ensure that even if this book is incredibly written, that we can get it to a wide audience. So that comes in the form of writers with Instagram followings or YouTube subscribers or Substack subscribers, or sort of like a plethora of like bylines in various like respected, quote unquote, like journalistic venues. So those things, it's like I'm constantly thinking of both those things together, the content, and then also how do I get this content to an audience?
Yeah, it's interesting.
And I assume your inbox is, flooded with proposals. How do you like sift through them? Is it what agent it's coming through,
Yeah.
or,
I mean, it's an interesting thing because like the agent system, which I don't know if you guys are like getting into that much on this podcast, but it's a traditional system that's like worked really well for a long time, but I'm not convinced it's the system that is the best for writers and publishers. And basically it's sort of, as like for listeners, at a major publisher like Penguin Random House, we won't necessarily consider a publication or a submission that comes straight from a writer. It usually needs to come through a publisher. Through an agent that we know and trust. And listen, that's not absolute. It's just sort of the general rule. And often I form relationships with writers outside of agents and then move towards publication. But often an agent works as another sort of gatekeeper in a lot of ways, and that is good and bad. But so having worked in publishing for over 10 years, I have extensive relationships with almost all of the agents in the industry. Therefore, they know what I'm interested in, they know what I'm good at, and they know what I can publish well at Crown, which is where I work now. So given that, they sort of gauge their submissions and will pick certain editors at certain houses to submit to. So as you sort of alluded to, Alice, I do generally go to emails from agents I know first because they know what I like. We have a relationship and I know they won't waste my time because my inbox is very, very full. So I start there and I will sometimes I read the cover letter first and sometimes I just dive into the proposal. It's actually not. I worked for an editor who did a lot of fiction and memoir and she never read the cover letter. She was like, I just want to like pretend I am picking up a book at a bookstore and just start reading it, which I think could work with fiction and works with fiction really well. But with nonfiction, a lot of the things I'm concerned in are like the thesis of the book, the platform again, and sort of like the credentials of the writer. So like I need to take that into consideration because readers will take that into consideration when deciding whether or not to buy a book. But then also then at the end of the day, it's in the read. Like, I don't know. I've rarely bought a book that I thought the proposal was like terribly written. I have, and granted, then, there have been considerations that maybe it was something by a celebrity or an expert and they are bringing something to the table that's beyond the actual writing. And that's something that we then fix in the process. But the proposal has to be engaging and compelling in the same way that when you open a book at the bookstore, you're probably only going to buy it if you want to keep turning the pages.
I'm so interested that you said that you're not sure if the agent process makes a lot of sense. What do you mean? Because your inbox is so flooded, and don't you need those gatekeepers? Otherwise, you could be really overwhelmed.
Listen, I don't have a better system, but I'm really interested in like further equity within the publishing industry. And the publishing industry has been very white and very rich for a very long time. And it's worked in a traditional way for a very long time. So I think if we collectively, as people in the media industry, are interested in changing it, then we have to change the way in which we do things. I don't have a better system in mind, but as I think just the fact that you guys are producing this podcast, which I imagine is like seeking to reach writers, right? And sort of like pull the veil back from how it all works. That to me is an indicator that the system is not equitable and fair and transparent in the way that maybe it should be. So I actually think that conversations like this are a good step in that process. Yeah, I don't know what the alternative is. I will say I do make an effort, and not as much as I should, but to reach out to sort of younger agents of color, and also just people who might not be so established in the industry, and make connections with them. I think that's something all editors should do, because the way in which sort of the agenting model works is that success begets more success. You sell a giant book, it's a bestseller. More authors come to you, you sell another book, it's a bestseller, and you become sort of very powerful. But it's really hard to sort of break in and penetrate that system. And again, I don't have an alternative, but I'd love to, entertain and imagine a world and an industry where success doesn't always have to beget success, but there's just a bit more of a meritocracy.
Yeah. I mean, you yourself did that with your career in a way, right? Because you started out, I mean, you've worked your way up through, I don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. You're,
totally.
Working at all these different houses, and also maybe consolidation a little bit, how that's affected things.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I would say I'm very privileged in a lot of ways, and I recognize that privilege. I am from Virginia, but I was able to attend grad school at Columbia University for my MFA in poetry writing. And I made that decision because, one, I wanted to go into publishing as opposed to academia, which was the right choice. And two, they did offer me a scholarship, but my family was able to help defray the cost of going to Columbia University, which is tremendously expensive, and also living in New York City. So without the help of my family, I don't know if I would be here. And that's point blank true. And I want to tell everyone that. I did make a very concerted effort to network and to get into the sort of publishing conversation. But honestly, my first job came about because I had a friend whose sister's partner was looking for an editorial assistant. And she sort of sent out an email to our cohort at Columbia. And I said, I want that job. Who do I email? And I went after her, my friend, and then also I went after my friend's sister, whom I never met. And I was like, what is she looking for in an assistant? And I sort of wrote a deranged email that, got me an interview and then got me in the door at W.W. Norton. And that was both fortunate. I mean, very fortunate, because who got those emails? Only the people at Columbia. So that already is gatekeeping. That is frustrating, but also a system that I exploited and used. And yeah, I started there at W.W. Norton. I went to Hachette. So I'll say W.W. Norton is a sort of an outlier to the big five publishing. And I don't know if you guys want me to sort of talk about that.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting sort of phenomenon in the world. In New York publishing, and I would say in the world of US publishing, there's the big five, which are the big corporate entities. And then there's basically everyone else. W.W. Norton is sort of right under the big five in terms of market share, but they culturally are very different because they are employee owned, which allows them a lot of flexibility, and they're not beholden to shareholders, and they can therefore publish, I think, books that maybe they don't have to necessarily perform so highly, but are more culturally relevant. And it's a beautiful place and a beautiful publisher for that reason. But when I was there, I was not working on books that I was personally invested in. So I knew I had to sort of move on and go someplace where I could really work on books that I cared about. So I went to Hachette, which is another one of the big five. And it is owned by a French media company, but you don't see a lot of the sort of impact of the Frenchness in the culture of it. And from there, I went to Macmillan, which is German owned, and then to PRH. And I've been at PRH for almost, which is Penguin Random. And PRH is the biggest in market share, and you feel it. You feel the power and sort of the caliber of my colleagues, which is tremendous and unparalleled within the industry. And also our ability to do things like print, beautiful 4-color books overseas, and also do so in a very quick timeline and ship books anywhere in the world. So all of those things make my job a lot easier, and also makes my job of attracting writers a lot easier.
At such a big book, at such a big imprint such a big publishing house with so many imprints, how does that work? Like, do you, I know there's like, I'm with Doubleday, but there's also Random, there's this. Do you all come to sales meetings together and pitch things, or how do they decide which books to really emphasize in the publishing process? Or, because it does seem like it's a bit baked in, I should say, like which books end up getting a lot of push, and then those guys end up getting more attention, and then they get more, it kind of goes down the...
It's funny. It's like the imprint system and like the division system is like, it's both ridiculous and also very effective. So, and it's hard to learn. Again, it's very hard. It's very opaque. And I remember when I was applying to jobs initially, and then also when I moved jobs, I would study Wikipedia. I would study the corporate websites. I would study Publishers Marketplace, which is this sort of trade website, to say what imprint, and like who works at what imprints and what books do they do? It's also not even like clear to the agency community, because some of it is only known internally. So I'll say it's ridiculous, but also important. And why do all these exist? How do they serve the books? Great question. They kind of started all initially as like separate publishing houses. And then as you alluded to, Julie, they sort of came together and got bought up. Even today, there was a report that Penguin Random House bought an independent publisher called Hay House, which is to say Hay House has independently been publishing a lot of practical and sort of spiritual, non-Western oriented books for a long time, and very successfully. Now they've been bought by Penguin Random House, which will probably change their list, give them a lot of opportunities to distribute widely, but also might restrict what they're doing in certain ways too, which is, of course, the trade-off of corporate life. I would say within any imprint, there are always going to be books that are given more budget and sort of like more time and energy. That's often based on, the profile of the author, but also the past performance of the author. But all this is to say that sort of attention is not destiny. And right now I'm working on a book that is beautifully written, debut, just sort of like a gorgeous ruminative book about sound underwater. And it's called Sing Like Fish. And it's about how sound underwater actually dictates the underwater environments across the entire world, and how shipping and boating and like pile driving is affecting these underwater environments. And we actually have an opportunity to fix that at this moment, and for it to not all go wrong, like sort of the rest of climate change. But it's her first book. She's a beautiful writer. And this has been a book that's really been embraced by our sales team, who's really enjoyed reading it. And, we're going to push it in a big way. So it doesn't always, although for everything I said earlier in this conversation, that platform and audience is really important, there's always sort of hope for those books that are just beautiful and meet the moment in a really important way. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Do advances relate, like are advances important in terms of like what you pay up front, in terms of how much emphasis you put at the back end, like at the publicity part?
I would say every single book does get in the same treatment, in the sense that like you have your own publicist. This isn't my imprint. You have your own publicist, you have your own marketer, you have a marketing and publicity teams that are invested in everything that you're doing. But as it sort of stands to reason, if a company invests, millions of dollars into a book versus say hundreds of thousands of dollars, there's going to be sort of like a variation in sort of how that book is sort of treated within the company. And like it would be kind of like naive not to think that. But again, it doesn't always mean destiny. And what I like still find exciting about this industry and this job is that like the magic, and like, and this will sound a little like schmaltzy right now, but like the magic of like a powerful book, and people read it like corporately and they are like, wait a second, this could be, you know, the next sort of, even, I mean, take a book like, say, Lessons in Chemistry, which is like a huge like international bestseller and a TV show and yada yada, like a debut by that woman who didn't know anybody. And again, that's fiction, and it can work a little differently, but like, you never know. And you never know sort of what writers are going to really touch readers in a huge way. So that's why we keep publishing so many books, because this happens, and it's a beautiful thing. So, but I understand what your question was, which is like, yes, we're, you know, is Prince Harry's book going to get a certain treatment that's maybe a little different than my debut writer? Yes. But that isn't to say that my debut writer can't be a bestseller too.
One kind of consequence of how opaque some things sometimes feel from the writer's side is you hear about like, I mean, you know, like, I don't know, when I wrote my first book, I didn't necessarily know a lot of other people who had written books. I knew other journalists, but I would hear rumors like, oh, you have to hire your own editor, you know, you have to hire your own publicist. So I was wondering like how much of that you encounter, and kind of like, I did end up on my first book hiring a fact checker.
Yeah.
Which was incredibly expensive, but I think was the right, I don't know, felt like the right thing to do. I'd come from the magazine world, so I just kind of knew how many mistakes you make even when you think you're being really careful. But yeah, I guess, I don't know, like, well, now it's sort of a different question, but like, do you think publishers will ever move towards having in-house
in all freelance models?
And like, how many of these sort of like shadow people that it seems there's an infinite, you know? Yeah.
That's a great question. And it's like a part of the publishing industry that I think more people need to talk about, but is not necessarily discussed. I will say it is the exception that like you as an author would have to necessarily hire, I mean, first of all, an editor, unless things have gone really sour. But if you're sort of, because you should be able to, it should start with an agent, right? It sort of should start, and I could talk about that process as well too, but maybe you guys talk to agents about that. Like if you have an agent whom you trust and who's invested in your career, then they are going to hopefully submit if it's a nonfiction book, to editors that they trust, and that they were going to treat the book with the care that it deserves to make it the best thing it possibly can be. Sometimes things go haywire, and I've heard of it when like a writer is not happy with how their editor is editing. So then they feel like they have to hire someone else, but that should really be the exception of the rule. And there should be lots of sort of checks / other sort of strategies before you get to that point. So there's that. Fact checking, that's real, which is to say that like, as a publisher, we consider the fact, and this kind of comes down to contractual like stuff. Like we consider the content of, we're paying you to produce the best possible content, you, the writer, the best possible content of the book. And that includes the correctness. So that includes fact checking. And that is often something that I think more and more sort of writers and agents need to talk about, which is like, should we set aside part of this advance to pay a fact checker? Because your job as the writer is to deliver the best possible version of the book. Our job is to shape the content, but like, I'm not a fact checker, and like, we don't employ fact checkers. There have been sort of imprints that have done that one-off. The cost, as you know, Alice, is very high, and it's hard to sort of guarantee that. So yes, that is something to consider. In terms of like a publicist, again, in my experience at PRH, like our publicists are phenomenal. They are working on a lot of books, as all of us are, but like they are really good at what they do, and they have the best relationships in the business. But that's not true everywhere. And I think it kind of comes back to equity in a lot of ways, which is to say that like, yeah, if you have sort of extra money and you don't need to like live on your advance, then like it couldn't hurt to like hire an extra publicist. But the flip side of that is sometimes it can, because sometimes too many cooks in the kitchen can be challenging. So there's a lot of things to weigh there. But I hate that there are writers that would think that like, okay, if I can't pay a publicist $10,000, then my book has no chance. And that's 100% not true. But there is there are writers out there who can do that, and they succeed with it sometimes too. So again, it's one of those places sort of in publishing that I think is a problem. And part of this, I think, that could be remedied with like higher budgets in publicity departments, the ability of book publishing to lure high level publicists from various industries into the industry, as opposed to there being publicists who leave corporate jobs to go freelance because they can make more money. Like, that's such a tragedy in our industry, because we want the best people and we want them to be working with us to, promote the hell out of our books. So, yeah.
So true. So we were like doing one question where we're asking everyone, which was, if you could give one piece of advice to a writer, just sort of in closing, what's like the one thing that you would like nonfiction writers to know? Which I know is a big question.
No, I love it. I love it. I just want to like think about it, like, and I want it to not be glib, and I want it to, okay, this will sound glib and mean, but I'm going to say it anyways, which is like, if you like believe you can do anything else, then do that, and like, don't become a writer. But if writing is absolutely what you have to do, and you fully believe in the power of it, and you just have no choice, you feel as though you have no choice, then yes, please keep writing. And if you make that commitment, like, and I'm not to say that success will come, but you will find what you need, and you will find satisfaction in it if you are truly driven by the power of writing. But again, if you can do anything else, and I think I would tell this to my 2-year-old, do it, because it's really challenging. Also, my other piece of advice is don't quit your day job necessarily. As I'm sure, Julie, you might know. Like, it's living off of book advance, and also sort of putting that pressure on yourself is really challenging in a lot of ways. Even if taking this time and space to write is a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I can't argue with that.
I mean, okay, here's maybe another piece of advice, which is like, read contemporary books. Like, go into a bookstore and read, and everything that you see on like the nonfiction desk, on the nonfiction table, like, read it, or read what you're attracted to, and read your competitive titles. If you're going to try to write a book that appeals to a reader of Glennon Doyle, read all of Glennon Doyle. If you want to write a novel that competes with like The Hate U Give, like, read The Hate U Give and read the rest of her novels. Know your market, and it will only make you a better writer.
So let's say a writer is, impressed you enough to get acquired by Penguin Random House. What can they then do? Do you have any pet peeves? How does a writer stay on an editor's good side?
Good question.
Yes, this is a great question. Hit your deadlines. If you hit your deadlines, and that is on all regards, like contractual, like manuscript deadlines, mini chapter deadlines, descriptive copy deadlines, author photo deadlines, marketing big mouth deadlines. If you hit your deadlines, you will be the number one author in the house, and everyone will work harder for you. And not joking.
Wait, so many authors don't hit deadlines? Like, that's a chronic issue?
Okay. It is. It really is. So 1, hit your deadlines. 2, do not let good be the enemy of perfect, which is really hard to tell a writer in a lot of ways. It actually kind of like correlates to the point about deadlines, which is to say, we are all grappling with like a lot of content, like all day, every day. And I realize that like your book is your baby, and like you want it to be perfect, but like there are practical considerations that we have to put into play, which is how long it takes to copy edit it, how long it takes to print it, how long it takes to promote it. And if you work within the constraints that we sort of offer, which are like, if you hit these deadlines, we will then offer these, we will copy edit the book. We will print the book. If we can work in tandem together, it's only going to benefit everyone. And don't be too precious about your work that it is at the detriment of your relationships and deadlines.
Okay. As a journalist, I take that. I get that. I hear that. I will never miss a deadline, I promise.
I think this is the other terrible advice I got when I sold my first book. Someone was like, oh, like deadlines in publishing, they're not like deadlines in journalism. They're just a suggestion.
I mean, okay, so that's like, here's the irony of it. Like, that is true. However, because like if you run a daily paper, like, yes, you're going to press tomorrow. But in publishing, like, yes, we could squeeze another day out of it. However, a lot of things are relationship based. And so if you actually hit your deadlines, because so few writers do, like I said, you will be the number one author in the house and everyone will want to work with you. And that goodwill is priceless. So the deadlines are flexible, but if you can have this sort of like personal wherewithal to hit them, then that's setting yourself up for success.
I'm going to hand in my edits on my first pass like today. They're due next Monday, but I have them done. They're
an angel. Also,
I'm going to do it.
If you want to like give yourself one more day to like read them over, yes, do that. But also you hand them in early, like also before the holidays, everyone's going to love you. So do it.
All right. That's awesome. Libby, it was so fun to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of How Books Work. Join us on our next episode as we continue to explore publishing behind the scenes.